What is far-left ideology? This is a good question. I think defining ideology is a lot harder than most suggest. Phrases like right-wing, left-wing, centrist, and far alternatives are thrown out a lot. And there's a lot of tools out there like political compasses or online quizzes. But really, all of these are immensely flawed. And I think there's a lot of unseen nuances. The way I see right vs left wing is a fight between hierarchy and equality. Right-wingers like hierarchy. They tend to believe in parental rights and the traditional family, traditional authority figures, church leaders, police, and far-right figures go even further with stuff like dictatorship, theocratic states and monarchies, which is obviously a very hierarchical structure. Of course, even this has its nuances. Lots of libertarians are right-wing. And if you look at the United States, most right-wingers believe in smaller government and weak centralized control. Authority and hierarchy are key concerns to right-wingers. But they aren't always in sync. Left-wingers, meanwhile, like equality. This is expressed in all sorts of common left-wing beliefs. Social justice issues like fighting racism, homophobia, or sexism are all attempts to increase equality. Fighting for political reform and voting rights is a fight for equality. Even economically, stuff like free healthcare is an attempt to create a more equitable society in their eyes. So, going off this theory, a far-left ideology is one that takes equality to the extreme. Communism is the idea that, and this is a brief summarization of a very complex and multi-layered ideology. Everyone is theoretically equal, works together and all have shared equal wealth. Proponents of extreme anarchism want a society without government. There is no hierarchy, and everyone has equal authority. I'd say the line between left-wing and far-left is institutional. Left-wingers, at least in America, still, mostly, believe in banks, money, capitalism, the existence of a military and police, etc., while far-left ideologies tend to question the basic systems and institutions of a society. Like capitalism as a system, the banking industry, healthcare, etc., they usually oppose the existing core institutions, systems and want to change them. Of course, again, there are degrees to this. Many non-far-left left-wingers question the healthcare system and want universal healthcare. A lot of issues originally far-left or far-right can drift into the mainstream. Once legal marijuana was a fairly extreme position but became a moderate one over time. Anyways, hope this helped. Let me know if you want any clarifications. Socialism, communism, syndicalism, anarchism, and some more. And of course the subbranches to them all. Edit. I guess the proper term could be anarcho-communism, because there is anarchism on the right side as well. But when people simply say anarchism 99/100th times they mean the left-wing one. Far left has a number of degrees. But let's go to one of the key sources. The Communist Manifesto, which has a few key ideas. 1. The abolition of private property in land and inheritance. 2. Introduction of a progressive income tax. 3. Confiscation of rebels' property. 4. Nationalization of credit, finance, communication, radio, TV, media, and transport, planes, trains, automobiles, everything. 5. Expansion and integration of industry and agriculture. The government decides what gets made, what gets grown. 6. Enforcement of universal obligation of labor. Nobody is unemployed. 7. Provision of universal education. Nobody is illiterate. 8. Abolition of child labor. It's item number 1 that really sets apart left from far left. Communism, unless you're in America, in which anything left of Machen is considered radical left. It's very interesting how basically all the answers are like, oh, we just want to end racism, homophobia, like y'all know what far-insert ideology here is, right? Far-right obviously is not a good thing and is right-wing politics to the extreme. So far-left would also be left-wing politics but taken to the extreme, and would not necessarily be a good thing. Just find it funny that Reddit is all like, far-right is the worst, they're Nazis who want to kill minorities. And then far-left is, we just want peace and love and equality for all. Quote, anarcho-communist. Depends on who you ask. Certain people consider rational moderatism to be far-left. Communism. Depends on what country you're referring to. Everyone here is giving pretty off-base answers. Left-wing ideologies are defined by collectivism, unity, and collaboration. The farthest position on a political spectrum is defined by excessive use of force or violence to achieve the goals of that position. The far left is the excessive use of force to achieve unity and collaboration, where you are forcing people to collaborate or face death. They are militant without discretion. You will be killed if you do not conform and obey the creed of the faction and their definition of unity. We haven't seen any far-left ideologies in the world survive long, and we haven't seen many far-right ideologies survive long. Turns out people don't really have a penchant for violence. Abortions at any time, don't have a border, whites pay blacks, lock up anyone who disagrees with you. Putting emphasis on cooperation over competition and passing laws that enable a society to thrive. When people cooperate rather than compete. It depends on who you ask. Lots of weird answers. Left wing and right wing can be fairly meaningless and depends completely what current time and location. Keep in mind the idea of left wing and right wing is largely born out of one to be able to manipulate people into siding with one side even on issues they wouldn't normally support them on. It's the source of the awful political polarization we have today. Maybe people willing to murder people for the protection, equality of others? Most of us just do protests. Ideology is just a name for a systematic grouping of ideas. And there are hundreds if not thousands of them. There are also many ways of grouping and classifying ideologies. And also there are many country-specific circumstances which determine what is considered left or right. A lefty in Texas is very different from a lefty in New York. It's always a label used relative to whatever is considered opposite on the specific political spectrum. But if I had to choose a common denominator, I'd say far left and far right are very much sister ideologies which share many of the same ideas. These stem from the fact that they are both collectivist. They always have an imaginary group whose interests they represent. They both believe the collective is more important than the individual. They both aren't really huge fans of free speech or democracy as they believe they are inherently flawed. They also both don't like rule of law. And they both dream of a single-party state in which the party controls not just politics but also the entire economy. And of course, both are prone to conspiracy theories. The only real difference is that the far left thinks of their imaginary collective as a social class, whereas the far right defines their preferred imaginary collective as an ethnic group. But, of course, given the opportunity, either of these will always work to create totalitarian states, persecute opponents, and centralize decision-making to ensure the benefit of their preferred imaginary collective. And of course, the party itself. Those would be the extremes on both ends of the spectrum. But most societies don't really have both at the same time because the entire political spectrum is usually moved to the left or to the right when compared to other countries. From a European perspective, I'd say there is very little far-left politics in America. There is some, but it's very marginal, whereas the far-right part of the political scene is very much thriving and somewhat mainstreamed. In Europe, there are countries like Hungary, whose entire political landscape is very much shifted to the right, and what they call left. There is just a mildly more moderate version of fascism. And then there are some countries like, say, Sweden, whose political scene is more to the left in its entirety, which means what they call far right is much more vanilla than in, say, Hungary. Strictly speaking, everyone has a far left or far right by definition because we think of politics as a spectrum shaped like a rainbow, but the meaning of the term is so local and relative it's practically meaningless. The far prefix usually just ends up being used to denote that some option is extreme, and it's often used by people who simply disagree with it, i.e., it's rarely used when people self-describe. And another popular way to delineate far anything from other political options is whether they support the democratic process. For example, any terrorist group is by definition far something simply because they chose violence to fight for their cause, instead of handing out leaflets or running in elections. Holding a two-legged pig accountable for its actions. I suspect you're asking this question because Donald Trump recently called for the extermination of extreme leftists. Okay, back to the beginning. The paradigm of right versus left comes from France. The right supported the king, and the left supported the revolution of the peasants to overthrow the king. The terminology has stuck because it represents the basic political struggle of every country. Hierarchy versus equality. In particular, Donald Trump thinks of himself almost like a king, and after the 2020 election, he became a king in exile. The right. In France, you had the kings, the nobles, the clergy, and the peasants who worked the land. If you were born into the right class, you lived a life of luxury. If not, you toiled. The rich lived in opulent palaces and threw lavish parties, while the poor performed backbreaking labor. Today, the extreme right is mostly associated with Imperial Russia, Nazi Germany, the American Confederacy, and Saddam's Iraq. These states are characterized by brutal enforcement of a hierarchy. For example, nobles versus peasants, plantation owners versus slaves, the dominant religion versus other religions, etc. The common theme is that there are in-groups and out-groups, and the out-group is afforded fewer rights. The left. In France, the left sought to abolish the power of the monarchy and the church. This would theoretically result in a more equal society. In doing so, they basically overthrew the nobles, confiscated their palaces, and ultimately turned on each other. This obviously didn't work out as planned, which will sadly become a common theme with revolutions through history. Today, the extreme left is associated with the French and Russian revolutions along with other peasant revolutions that sought to abolish class boundaries and systems of private ownership, but mostly just ended up with another strong man in charge. The more moderate left is associated with democracies in Western Europe that are characterized by a strong social safety net, social mobility, and a smaller gap between rich and poor. In these countries, private ownership is still allowed, but it's regulated to prevent abuses. Religion is still tolerated, but it doesn't wield power over society the way it used to. US politics. In the US, The moderate left stands for things like workplace regulations, a social safety net, and eliminating discrimination of various types. Some extreme leftists might call for abolishing the police, abolishing eating meat, and things like that. But this version of the left is mostly a caricature that features prominently in right-wing memes. The right wants to bring back various forms of hierarchy based on race, class, and ownership of property. In their view, businesses should be able to discriminate openly on race, religion, and gender, and workers should have less protections. The extreme right would be the ones calling for an official state religion, the extermination of their enemies, etc. People on the extreme right often fantasize about situations where society collapses or is radically reformed, and their in-group has to take charge. Sometimes they stockpile weapons and other supplies to be ready for that day. In recent years, this movement has coalesced into a cult of personality centered on Donald Trump, who, as mentioned earlier, considers himself a king in exile. It's not that simple to classify one group of beliefs as far-left ideology. There are a wide variety of people with a wide variety of beliefs that all classify themselves as far-left who have very different goals, and evaluating the beliefs of everyone who classify themselves as far-left just doesn't work. You have your Democratic Party's far-left members, who would be moderate, typical mainstream left wing in many European countries who are called communists by opposing politicians. You have people who might vote for third-party candidates such as the Green Party who call themselves far-left. There are people who identify as socialist or communist who believe the world needs to become that through legal elections, and people with the same labels who believe that legal elections will never work to achieve their goals. And under these umbrellas there are even more specific ideologies you can find, like anarchism or even fascism. Two radically different beliefs for the right way to achieve economic equality. Many leftists believe the perfect form of being left-wing has never been achieved in reality. And some think modeling government after the USSR or CCP is what we should be doing. Because of this variety in beliefs, there isn't really one example for what being far-left is, as many people vehemently disagree with each other. The only real umbrella ideas that most leftists agree with are change, anti-establishment, and equality.
If you enjoyed this video, please check out our playlists full of similar content. Epic Eracast is like doom scrolling for your ears. Please like, share, and subscribe.